In November of 1927, a gang operating in Montana and North Dakota was killing off its own gang members. Since September of 1927, 4 banks, 4 stores, some warehouses, and 1 post office in northeast Montana and southern Saskatchewan had been robbed. 2 men had been assaulted, with one of them dying from wounds, and a highway robbery of 2 farmhands occurred. None of the bandits affiliated with any of those crimes, except for the Glentana bank robbery, had yet been captured. At least 1 gang member in the Glentana heist was in jail in North Dakota after his confession in a story we covered in several videos, including September 1927's Bad Men in the Badlands. Police in 2 states and the Canadian province of Saskatchewan were considering the question, was Tommy Thompson killed after the Kennedy murder? The chief of police of Minot, North Dakota, believed that Thompson was dead, shot and killed by his pals in crime, and buried in a coulee, or a depression in the ground that fills with water like a wet weather creek, for example, and that was located near Plentywood, Montana. The sheriff's office in Wolf Point, Montana, supported that thought, believing that Tom Dutch Gary, 38, also known as Tommy Thompson, had been murdered in a quarrel with gang members. He was an ex-convict from the North Dakota pen and was wanted by Montana authorities for alleged participation in various robberies. He was also wanted in connection with the bank robbery of the First State Bank at Freud that we covered in an October 1927 video titled Montana Marauders Hit More Banks. The story was that Thompson had been shot for, quote, talking too much, end quote. Thompson's killers were thought to have scattered out of Montana after hiding the body and absconding with $10,000 that he had on his person. Rewards of $500 each were posted by Sheriff Anderson for the apprehension of Thompson, along with Harry Locke and J.N. Roberts, who was possibly the gang's leader and was also known as Art Williams and Art Henshaw. Harry Locke, 35, wanted for his alleged participation in several Montana heists, was possibly also, quote, marked for death, end quote. He was thought to have escaped into Canada wearing women's clothing, which is actually not as unusual as it may sound. We came across an earlier example of that, and I know we have a future example as well. A different thought was that Locke may have been hiding in his, quote, old hangout in Minot, end quote, and that Thompson was hiding with old friends there as well. J.N. Roberts and a man known only as Blackie, along with 2 other unknown associates, had been sought by North Dakota authorities for the past 4 years for the slaying of a marshal at West Hope, North Dakota. A possible connection to Thompson involved Michael Kennedy, 40 years old, a bachelor farmer who lived 9 miles north of Raymond, North Dakota. Kennedy was, quote, severely beaten by 2 masked men, end quote. A hired man, a farmhand helper named Metters, had also been assaulted. The farm's telephone connection had been severed, and the attackers escaped in Kennedy's car. Kennedy died a few days later, and the car was found in a straw stack near Flaxville, Montana. Thompson was allegedly connected to this assault, murder, and car theft, according to John Keller of Raymond. Keller identified the pipe found at the Kennedy home as that belonging to Thompson, and Thompson had lived with Keller right up until shortly following the Kennedy murder. Francis Tucker, a Verona, North Dakota farmer, took the stand in his own defense, charged with first-degree murder. He denied any implication in the death of Hans Bjorn, cashier of the Farmer and Merchants Bank of Verona. Sadly, it turned out that supposedly Tucker and Bjorn had been friends. We introduced the Verona heist in a story we covered in a March 1927 video titled Murder, Mayhem, Money. Circumstantial evidence that Tucker was the last man in the bank the afternoon of the killing, and that his financial transactions began in earnest shortly after, consumed much of the hearing, including that Tucker had paid $100 on an account that was owed to a B.J. Knudsen, a Verona feed mill manager, and that was only about an hour and a half after the robbery and murder. The jury deliberated since noon on Thursday and reported its verdict on November 18th. Tucker entered the courtroom for the reading of the verdict. His face was, quote, slightly blanched, but he walked to his seat confidently, end quote. He squirmed a bit when the verdict was handed to the judge, and he, quote, gasped so loudly it was audible throughout the courtroom, end quote, when the judge read the verdict. Tucker had been found guilty and was sentenced to life in the state penitentiary. Of course, an appeal was assumed to follow. Now, a different scalawag we covered working in that same area was Lester Barge. Lester Barge, charged with killing H.N. Peterson, cashier of the Citizens State Bank of Wheelock, North Dakota, way back on November 12, 1926, was also found guilty of the first-degree murder in a Williston, North Dakota court. Barge, only 27, was sentenced to spend the remainder of his life in the North Dakota Penitentiary at Bismarck. H.N. Peterson had been killed when Barge and Tex Gibson robbed that Wheelock bank. Jack Tex Gibson, maybe also known as Slim Gibson, had already been serving life in the Stillwater, Minnesota prison for the murder of Marshall Frank Darlene of Isanti, Minnesota. Barge was naturally sought by Minnesota officials to prosecute him for the same murder Gibson had already been found guilty of. In addition, a third man, none other than Jack Northrop, a man we've covered previously as well, was serving life for the Darlene killing already. Nebraska authorities also wanted Barge for bank robberies there, as well as a shooting of a town marshal in Taylor, Nebraska. Of the 19 witnesses who testified against Barge, 3 were ex-convicts or were currently in prison. John Longre and Gust Quitt, along with currently incarcerated Richard Broomfield. All 3 stated Barge had claimed that he'd killed Peterson. Lester Barge displayed no emotion upon the reading of his guilt and sentencing for first-degree murder, and he was to be taken to the penitentiary immediately following sentencing by Warden J.J. Lee. Barge was ineligible for a chance at a pardon until he'd served 20 years of his sentence. Newly emerging information on Barge was that he was suspected of having knowledge of the, quote, disappearance of Peter Widall, end quote. Barge and Jack Northrop had been in the neighborhood at the time of Widall's disappearance. These aren't the nicest of people, but they're just the type of killers and robbers we follow on Decades of Gangsters from 1926 until 1941 in U.S. involvement in World War II. Sheriff A.V. Lawrence of Scobie, Montana, arrested A.J. McDonald in the Pete Stewart Pool Hall in Plentywood, Montana. McDonald was charged with participating in the October 19th robbery of the State Bank of Flaxville, where $4,500 in cash and about $1,500 in Liberty bonds had been taken by unmasked robbers. Sheriff Lawrence and a lumberman from Flaxville named Milo Kingsley arrested McDonald, the latter there to help identify him as the leader of the 4-man crew of robbers. Kingsley was in the bank when McDonald told him to, quote, stick 'em up, end quote. McDonald was locked up in the Plentywood town jail and then taken to Scobie by train that next morning. He hadn't admitted to anything and looked, quote, like a cool customer, end quote, while in custody. McDonald was arraigned and pleaded not guilty. Detective Sergeant Mortimer of the Saskatchewan Provincial Police happened to be in Scobie, Montana, 2 weeks earlier on his way further east seeking information about a couple of people suspected of robbing a store near Regina, Saskatchewan. He thought the Chrysler car used by the Outlook, Montana bank robbers covered previously was not actually found in Canada, but Canadian Customs and Immigration officers were on the lookout. Apparently, conviction of robbery with violence or while in possession of weapons in Canada resulted in, quote, a prison sentence and the lash, end quote, adding, quote, it is severe, but gun-toting and thuggery need to be dealt with severely, end quote. Importantly, Mortimer supposedly had familiarity and even records on most of the gang or gangs thought to be operating around Plentywood, Montana, and Minot, North Dakota. We typically picture Chicago when we think of gangsters, but those previous stories show that the Dakotas, Montana, and even into Canada were not only immune, but were hotbeds. Now, even less likely, we head to a tiny town in Wyoming. The northern Wyoming town of Deaver saw its Bank of Deaver robbed shortly after noon. The cashier, E.M. Beaver, and his assistant, Miss Mamie McElligott, the bookkeeper, were held at bay as the bandits scooped cash from the till and the vault totaling around $900. The robbers were armed, and the experience shook McElligott, who, quote, became hysterical and was ordered to take a seat, end quote. Meanwhile, Beaver argued with the men during the heist, showing his feisty side. One man guarded the door while the others scooped the cash. They exited the bank and hopped into, quote, an old car, end quote. Cashier Beaver called the police at Basin immediately, who in turn notified Sheriff John Albert, who concluded that they were probably heading for the, quote, broken country in the east part of this county or the Indian reservation beyond, end quote. Towns along that route were alerted, focusing on Prior Gap. By one account, Beaver told a man who owned a, quote, fast Willis Knight, end quote, car to get on the trail of the robbers to keep them in sight, while a different source stated that Beaver and a friend named Grant Taggart jumped into a car to follow the robbers after alerting the sheriff's office. A different version had a determined dozen of posse men, some of whom were armed with .22 caliber rifles, overtake the robbers when that old car failed at or across the Montana line where the posse then surrounded the bandits. A third take had the robbers drive toward a group of officers at Sage Creek. The police opened fire, so the men took to foot and then engaged in a brief, fruitless firefight. When captured, they gave their names as Roy Murray, 40, Earl White, 29, and Tom Kirk, 29, which quickly proved to be lies and aliases, and also gave up two .45 Colt automatic revolvers, one .38 automatic revolver, and a .30-30 Winchester, along with all of the money taken. The trio was arrested and taken to the county jail at Basin, Wyoming. While there, they confessed and offered up a new set of names: Fred Hayes, alias Jack Hardy, Walter Davis, and E.L. Vestal, alias Tom Kirk. Two of the three were thought to have, quote, bad records, end quote, and were wanted elsewhere for various serious crimes. The sheriff at Basin thought they were from out of state, and that the trio was wanted in Minneapolis for robberies there. In fact, he thought that they were the same men who'd been selling magazines throughout northern Wyoming over the past several months. They were taking the checks they received and raising them meaning altering the amount written on the checks to a higher amount. Turned out, to no one's surprise, that old car had been stolen from Billings, Montana, and bore a Montana license plate with records that show that it belonged to a Jacob Aller of Billings. That same Deaver Bank had been broken into 2 times previously in 1927, though both of the other attempts resulted in failed robberies with no money taken from the locked vault. And since the trio was suspected of having ties to the Twin Cities, we should head back to Minnesota, a surprising center of gangster-era crime, for a new heist from a new robbery crew. 4 robbers comprised this gang. 3 men entered the First National Bank of Ironton, Minnesota, while 1 remained as the getaway driver parked across the street from the bank, and this occurred right before closing time. They were later described as medium height and wearing unassuming clothes and hats. The trio cut the wires of the burglar alarm, locked the door after entering, and then one of them pulled down the curtains on the door and the windows. They were later thought to definitely not be amateurs, as they acted, quote, too cool, too workmanlike for anything but old hands, end quote. In part because they timed the heist with the monthly payroll payouts of the Inland Steel Company and the United Mining Company. Well, cashier A.H. Proctor was at his desk. T.S. Nyhus and Ernest Olson, assistant cashiers, were winding down bank business. J.O. Lindahl, the Crosby Ironton High School principal, was just finishing up business. One robber, armed with a, quote, heavy caliber revolver, told Lindahl in a low voice to go to the back of the bank. He complied and looked over his shoulder and saw another bandit covering the assistant cashiers and heard, quote, and stick 'em up, end quote. All 4 were forced to lie on the floor with their arms extended above their heads. One robber kept them covered, while the other 2 ransacked the counters and the drawers in the vault. Well, Olson must have showed some sort of displeasure at the bandit guarding him, as he was ordered to lie still, and then the bandit, quote, administered several kicks in the ribs, end quote. For whatever reason, Lindahl earned a light kick in the head as well. After 5 minutes on the floor, they were ordered to get up and go into the vault. The bandits scored $35,000, but overlooked $4,500, which had been prepackaged for shipment to a neighboring community bank, along with some loose silver. Wilfred Johnson of Ironton happened to be passing the bank and noticed a Studebaker occupied by 1 man in the driver's seat smoking. Then 3 men exited the bank's back door and got into the car, quietly and unhurriedly seated themselves, and then the car headed toward Crosby, Minnesota. Inside the building, the vault inhabitants raised a ruckus, including shouting down a small ventilator shaft to G.A. Storm, a shoemaker who had a shop in the basement of the bank building. The shoemaker called a former bank employee who arrived at the bank and opened the vault. The alarm spread, but 30 minutes had already elapsed. A John Humphrey happened to be inspecting road construction south of Deerwood and notified authorities that a car, thought to be a Nash, passed by at a high rate of speed heading towards Bay Lake. Later, in the investigation, it was learned that the 4 robbers had been noticed in various spots around Ironton shortly before the robbery, and that previous to that, they'd even been noticed in front of the First National Bank of Crosby, Minnesota. So the upper Midwest and Mountain West continued to sizzle despite a turn to cooler weather. Next Saturday, we head to the warmer but equally as wild action of Oklahoma, where lawlessness abounded. Old names like Ray Terrell and Elmer Inman reappear, while new gangs and gangsters rage in conjunction with a significant narcotics robbery, making me wonder if drugs weren't emerging as fuel for robbery.